Hi, I'm Owen Stowe, VP of Engineering at Lede. Before I get started here, a little bit about Lede. We are a small sister company to Alley Interactive, which you may be familiar with, the agency. We're a platform for small to mid-sized independent publishers supporting a robust set of shared tools for editorial teams. So I will be your guide today for a foray into Headless Gutenberg. Some key takeaways you can expect today are an understanding of the problems you might face using Gutenberg on a site with decoupled architecture, two contrasting methods of addressing these problems, and their pros and cons using the Lede platform as an example, and a few ideas for how these solutions might evolve in the future. So a little bit about Lede, the application, as some background and context. We use a WordPress multi-site on the back end. We have a totally separate application that we host with Node, React, and Next.js on the front end. And we use GraphQL by way of the WP GraphQL plugin as a communication layer in the middle. All of this is hosted by our partners at WordPress VIP. And some background on GraphQL, for those of you who might not know what it is an API language specification. It's implemented in many different languages, one of which is PHP and WordPress by way of the WP GraphQL plugin, which I just mentioned. And GraphQL is descriptive. It lets you query exactly what you want and know exactly what you'll get in return. It's strongly typed, so that means all queryable fields have a type like text or number or date or a true false. And it's very developer friendly. So it enables a robust set of dev tools that make it easier to work with. All right, so diving into the problem here, the problem of integrating with Gutenberg in a decoupled environment. One of the main things I want you to take away from this section is about contracts. So what is a contract? It's basically a clearly defined set of rules by which two independent decoupled systems can communicate with one another. An analogy for this is USB. So if I'm a manufacturer of USB cables, I want to be sure that the cables I'm creating will fit all products that use USB-C in this example. So in order to do that, it requires a clear specification or a contract between the device manufacturer and the cable manufacturer. So this might include things like the size and shape of the port, the number of connector pins, the functional capabilities like charging or data transfer rate or things like that. So some ways that this analogy, this idea of a contract can apply are in decoupled applications like Lede. So we have our JavaScript front end, and it needs to request information about posts, pages, menus, et cetera, all the familiar WordPress things, in order to display those things to the end user properly. It can also apply to decoupled teams. So you might have some folks who are more specialized in WordPress or PHP. You have some other folks who are more specialized in JavaScript, UX, front end. And if one or the other team makes changes that impact what data is available on either end, they'll know about it if they have a contract before any of these changes make their way into production. These contracts transition those implicit or hidden rules into explicit and visible ones. Unfortunately, Gutenberg, at least initially, and this is changing quickly, was not really designed with taking decoupled into account. So it makes it more of a challenge for a decoupled site like Lede to integrate with Gutenberg, and requires us to find maybe some creative or even hacky solutions to some of the problems we encounter. All right, so diving into our solutions here. I'm going to go sort of chronologically here. So I'll start with a solution we implemented many years ago at this point, static HTML. And I'll fast forward a bit through a number of iterations that we made to our current present day solution using GraphQL. So to talk a little bit about this older solution that we had. So you've got a post. You've got a paragraph, 2 paragraphs, an image, this beautiful goat here. It's got a caption. You have a pull quote. You hit the publish button, it's saved to HTML, and then our front-end React application will take that HTML output, it'll request it, and pretty much render it as is to the end user using a single React component. There are some pros and cons to this approach. It's easy to implement comparatively. It works well for many types of blocks, so something like a paragraph or a heading block really doesn't have many requirements in the way of interactivity. It's just static HTML. Some cons, however, are that HTML is not very reliable as a data source. There are some performance concerns here as well. And perhaps the most important one is that you lose out on all the benefits of React. So React is a framework that lets you create rich and dynamic user interfaces. And if you choose to render Gutenberg content using static HTML, you sort of lose out on all of that. You get this beautiful, rich React experience for the editor in the back end, and then a sort of flat, boring experience for end users. It's kind of like buying a $5,000 gaming computer and just playing Minesweeper on it. Okay, fast forwarding to the present. This is the GraphQL solution that we have currently and are currently iterating on. And I'll preface this by saying that this is a solution that is not actually currently built into the WP GraphQL plugin. It's actually a solution that was introduced into WordPress VIP's decoupled plugin bundle through a collaboration between Alley developers, Lede developers, and some VIP engineers as well. So I wanted to give a little shout out to those folks and a thank you for building this system for querying Gutenberg content via GraphQL and making it possible for a company like Lede to use it. Excuse me. All right, so how does this work? Basically, you start with the same thing, same post, similar post anyway. You hit the publish button, it saves it to HTML once again. And then at this point, GraphQL gets a hold of it and it does a couple things. One of these things is it provides a contract for the idea of a block. So all blocks in Gutenberg share specific properties. Each of these have a specific data type. And GraphQL allows you to access them and specifies those types for you. So you end up with this contract for what does a block look like. And it includes things like a name, attributes, inner blocks, inner content, inner HTML, all of these things that all blocks share. At this point, the second thing that GraphQL does is that, or this particular solution does, is it uses built-in Gutenberg functionality to parse that HTML into a separate standardized format called JSON. And it makes this JSON queryable by GraphQL. So this lets us go block by block by block and decide, okay, how do we want to render or present each of these things individually? Which then creates the opportunity for us to leverage the full capabilities of React. And for the blocks that we need it, and then render the others statically. So an example of this is Lede's newsletter block. By rendering this with a custom React component, it lets us connect to our email service provider, and when a customer tries to sign up, we can give them real-time feedback about whether or not that succeeded without reloading the page. Here's an example of what a GraphQL JSON response looks like. So you can see that I'm querying the ID, the URI, the title, the date, excerpt, and then a list of blocks. And all of that information is coming back in exactly the same format that you queried it in. So it's pretty straightforward, and you know what to expect. All right, so to recap, some pros of this approach. You have much more control of how you want to display each block to the end user. Interactivity where you need it through React components, and static content where you don't. And you have more control over the data you're sending to the front-end application. And finally, you have a strict contract for the concept of a block. Cons to this approach are that there are no strict contracts for individual blocks, which I'll come back to in a second, and you still have some performance concerns. Okay, so moving forward into the future, into improvements that we can make to the GraphQL approach. Once again, coming back to this idea of a strict contract for every block, especially custom ones. So what this means is that you can specify all of the unique properties for each individual block, not just the idea of a block in general. So a core button, for example, might have text, a URL, button width, link target, some of these things. Every block defined in Gutenberg core, WordPress core, or even custom ones can specify these specific properties that are unique to them. So what you end up with is not just that general block contract, but a contract for core images, for core paragraph, for core pull quote, and then especially a contract for custom blocks. And what this means is that a block that you're building custom, which you're actively developing on frequently, there's not really going to be any surprises. Okay, so moving into some ideas that we've experimented with at Lede and are continuing to refine. One of these is shared queries for custom blocks. So if you have a block, custom block that you built, like this recommended post block, between the front end and the Gutenberg editor, you may have similar needs in terms of data requirements. So they both need to query a post. And what you can do with the GraphQL API is use the same query in both contexts. Oftentimes, there are differing user experience needs across the two things. So like in the Gutenberg editor, you need a rich text field where you can change the text, modify it, update it. In the front end, you can just render it as static content. However, they both need the same data. So it allows you to create some consistency in those data requirements while still differentiating the user experience. Similarly, you can share CSS and even React components. So there might be similar visual presentation needs across Gutenberg and the front end. And you can accomplish this by sharing a style sheet. What this does is it creates a bit more maintainability. You can make changes in one place and have them apply in both areas. And similarly, you can do that with React components as well. So you might have components that encapsulate certain elements of your user interface or user experience. Because both things are React, you can share those components across both of them. You end up with something that's a bit more WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get in the Gutenberg editor. It doesn't negate the need for previews, but it makes it more of a preview-like experience. Okay, so to recap, things I hope you learned are the importance of contracts in a decoupled environment and why they're a challenge with Gutenberg. The pros and cons of two methods of creating contracts with Gutenberg using static HTML or GraphQL, and how block-specific contracts, shared queries, and shared CSS can help us build better with decoupled Gutenberg. And here's some sources for you, which I'm happy to talk to you more about, and special thanks. All right, thank you.
Thanks, and we will be sharing out the presentation, so you'll have access to these presentations. Any questions? Yeah?
I guess I'll go first. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Is there anything in Gutenberg that you feel actively fights against you in terms of trying to deliver a decoupled experience? And I guess really what I'm asking is, what could the Gutenberg team be doing differently, or improvements, or wherever you want to take this question, to make what you're describing here easier?
Yeah, there's a couple things that spring to mind. I'll go back a step and definitely read this blog post that I link here. A lot of this information is coming from there. So, but one of those things is that something that would be extremely helpful when it comes to creating those contracts for specific blocks is if all blocks were registered in PHP. It makes it pretty challenging if there's a block that's only registered in JavaScript. So that's one thing. I think the other thing, and I guess just more generally speaking, is that there's also other inconsistencies between the JavaScript experience and API as between that and the PHP API. So yeah, I'm sure there are other things I could talk about, but that's the one that springs to mind. Yeah.
Why use GraphQL? Why not just use the REST API? And seems like that contractual data is all in the REST API. And I know there are some plugins that surface block data too. And so I'm just I know a lot of people like GraphQL. So
yeah,
that can't be a reason.
Mean, I think GraphQL is great. I think that we are making use of it in a way that, I think if you had even broader scope, it could become even more handy. Like if you had a mobile app or even other decoupled systems that need access to WordPress information, then GraphQL could be especially handy for that. We're a small team, and we constantly talk to each other. it's probably pretty unlikely that we're going to break stuff anyway. Also, we did, in fact, use the REST API before this current iteration of the platform, and it worked pretty well. It was a lot of custom work that we did. It didn't use core endpoints. Well, I guess actually initially it did, and that was very complicated for reasons that I won't get into in too much detail right now. But yeah. Yeah, I think so. Having that standardization, probably not necessary for every use case, but I think as the ecosystem of decoupled apps grows, it becomes more and more useful. Yeah.
Hey, that was interesting. Thanks. You mentioned there were performance problems with each approach. Can you give us like 1 or 2 sentences about each of the types of problems in each case?
Well, I think really most of what that is, at least the first thing that comes to mind, is it stems from the whole static HTML approach where, I mean, basically to get into more detail about what that flow looks like is you take the HTML that's spit out from Gutenberg, and then you have to sanitize it before presenting it to the user, which means, you know, cutting out anything that might be dangerous or cause security issues. And then also you have to run a separate parser to translate all of the HTML into React components, which is sort of happening anyway. React just does that. So basically you're just kind of duplicating effort for any given piece of post content. So that's really the main thing, I would say. Yeah.
Thanks.
So you propose the gold standard at the end where you reuse your components from your front-end rendering system.
Yeah.
Also in your headless CMS, and reusing styles too.
Sure.
But so sometimes Gutenberg gets in the way of doing that. How do you work around those challenges?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say there are certain cases where it makes a lot of sense to share components especially, and there's a lot of cases where it really doesn't. Which is why I would say that like sharing styles and sharing queries in our case with GraphQL makes more sense to use across the board than it does to share components. And actually in many cases it's actively counterproductive to try to share components because you end up having these couplings that just don't make any sense because the user experience is so different between the two environments. Yeah.
And then the styles, so the styles of the Gutenberg editor itself often interfere with styles you're trying to use or leverage exactly from your rendering system.
Yeah.
Did you have that experience too?
Yeah, definitely had that experience. I'm not sure I have a good solution for you on that. I think that like, again, probably sharing styles for custom blocks is where it comes in the most handy. But I think that is something that's changing over time. It's becoming easier slowly. But yeah, let's see, what else can I say about that? We've recently made more use of theme JSON, which has become come in significant. Yeah, it's been really handy.
Thanks. I've been answering questions about decoupled Gutenberg for the last 5 years. And none of them were.
Figured I wouldn't be the only one, yeah.
Right. So in the spirit of focusing on the why,
sure.
I know what Lede is. Can you talk for a second about Lede's customers and why like business and product requirements led you to decide on a decoupled architecture?
Yeah, totally. To be totally honest, one of the reasons was because this platform has gone through many iterations and it started decoupled and we're just sort of continuing in the pattern. It probably would have proved difficult to transition to coupling again. So that's one reason. I think the other reason also is that we in the current version of it, we've built a custom paywall, and it's made it a lot easier to sort of track the current user's state using a system like React than it would be if we were doing everything in server-rendered PHP. Yeah.
All right, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you, Owen.
Yeah.
Yeah.